For all its beauty and splendor, the wilderness can be a cruel teacher. If you're not prepared to hike up a mountain, you play with death. You're up against unforgiving terrain, unstable footing, and unpredictable weather. The trail can turn treacherous instantly. One misstep or failure to recognize the changing weather conditions can almost guarantee your demise. Let's venture back to the savage wilderness, where survival is earned, not given. This is Outdoor Disasters. For 6 Arizona Boy Scouts, their Mount Wrightson climb would be a tragedy. It all began on the evening of Tuesday, November 11, 1958, during a regular meeting of Boy Scout Troop 70. The Scoutmaster announced that there were no plans for the upcoming weekend. Eager to celebrate his 16th birthday on Sunday, November 16th, Scout Mike Early shared his plan to mark the occasion with a hike to the summit of Mount Baldy, now known as Mount Wrightson, in the Santa Rita Mountains in southern Arizona. Mount Wrightson is the highest peak in the range at 9,456 feet or 2,882 meters. It's a popular destination for hikers, offering challenging trails with stunning views of the surrounding Sonoran Desert and the rolling mountains. The Old Baldy Trail is the most popular and direct route to the summit. It's about 5.4 miles one way with an elevation gain of over 4,000 feet, making it a strenuous hike. Weather can change rapidly, especially during the monsoon season in the summer. Winter months can bring snow and ice, making the trails slippery and dangerous for unprepared hikers. Steep sections and switchbacks can be hazardous, particularly in bad weather. Mike Early and fellow scout Lou Burgess planned to start the hike on Saturday, November 15th, trekking from Madera Canyon to the site of the former fire lookout and returning to camp overnight in Madera Canyon. While Mike had previously hiked as far as Josephine Saddle, this would be his first time venturing beyond, making it a significant achievement for his birthday. Several other scouts expressed interest in joining the hike, and it was agreed that those who could get parental permission would gather at the Early residence with their gear at 10 a.m. on Saturday. On Saturday morning, November 16th, 6 boys gathered at the Early residence. Mike Early, who would turn 16 the next day, Michael Lanu, age 13, Lou Burgess, age 16, and Ralph Coltrane, age 12, David Greenberg, age 12, and Ron Sepulveda, age 11. On Saturday, November 15, 1958, the 6 boys loaded their gear into the Early family's Studebaker, and John Early, Mike's father, drove them toward Madera Canyon. The weather forecast looked promising, making it an ideal day for hiking. However, Lou Burgess had noticed a reddish tint in the sky that morning, recalling the old sailors saying, "Red sky in morning, sailor take warning." He mentioned it to Mike, but Mike laughed it off. They arrived at Madera Canyon around noon, and instead of driving all the way to the trailhead, John dropped the boys off at Madera Lodge, promising to pick them up the following day in time for the birthday celebrations. Once John left, the boys gathered their gear and headed to the Baldy trailhead, where they planned to set up their base camp. After about a half hour of hiking, they reached their campsite at the far end of the picnic area and began setting up. Mike Early, David Greenberg, and Ronnie Sepulveda pitched their tents while Lou Burgess strung his hammock between 2 trees. Ralph Coltrane and Michael Lanu built a makeshift shelter using a picnic table and a half tent that Michael had brought. With their camp set, the boys sat down for lunch before beginning their hike. They would hike on the Old Baldy Wilderness Trail, a picturesque hike through densely wooded lower slopes, and then onto the rocky crags in the higher reaches of the mountain. While the hike is somewhat challenging, the trail ordinarily is not considered to be a dangerous one. Overheating and lack of water are the usual concerns of southern Arizona hikers. Blizzards and Arctic weather are unheard of in the mild desert autumn, even at these heights. The weather forecast that morning was good. By all accounts, it was a perfect day for hiking. At around 1:15 p.m. on Saturday, November 15, 1958, Mike blew his whistle to gather the boys for the hike up the Baldy Trail, advising them to bring water and snacks. The temperature was a cool 56 degrees Fahrenheit. They hiked at a steady pace, stopping periodically to rest and take in the surroundings. About 2 hours later, they reached Josephine Saddle, where they had a break. Above Josephine Saddle, the Baldy Trail passes through two relatively flat areas before a long straight stretch leading to the switchbacks below Bellows Spring. The boys paused briefly near the first flat area, then continued, reaching the long straight stretch of the trail. As the boys continued their hike, they noticed massive clouds descending from above, darkening and swirling around the mountaintop. Rather than feeling alarmed, the scouts were intrigued by the unusual cloud formations. Ralph, stopping to take in the scene, thought, "It's looking a little spooky." But unaware of the danger the clouds posed, he was more excited by the idea of climbing higher and walking into them. The looming peak, appearing deceptively close, drew them further upward, fueling their desire to reach the summit. Unfortunately, as the day wore on, so did the boys. As they neared their goal, the trail grew steeper and their leg muscles began to ache. Staring at sheer drop-offs hundreds of feet below, they slowed their pace. The air became noticeably cooler and the wind began to pick up. Unbeknownst to them, conditions on the mountain were quickly deteriorating. During frequent rest stops, the scouts started to feel the cold seeping through their light jackets. Still, the group pressed on, each step becoming more grueling, especially for the younger boys. The strain took its toll on 11-year-old Ronnie, who, suffering from painful blisters, finally declared he couldn't continue. So it was decided he would wait while the others continued. However, as soon as they disappeared around the bend, Ron began to scream about being left alone. At first, Ronnie agreed, but as he watched his friends disappear around the next bend, he grew frightened. Lou Burgess stopped the group and they decided Ralph Coltrane would stay with Ron. Lou assured them they'd return in half an hour while the remaining four boys continued up the trail. After about 15 minutes after leaving Ron, the remaining group stopped again. With only an hour of daylight left, Lou faced a tough decision. Shadows were creeping across the trail, and though the peak seemed close, the growing darkness and worsening weather weighed heavily on his mind. Lou noticed he was also showing signs of fatigue. Their original plan to reach the summit had become flawed. Starting the hike around 1 p.m. left little time to summit before nightfall. In late fall, the sunset was around 5:30 p.m., and with their slow pace, time was running out. Worse yet, the boys had made a critical error that many seasoned hikers had made before. They hadn't set a turnaround time to descend. Lou tried to convince the others to turn back. It was already 4:45 p.m. with about an hour of daylight left and the temperature dropping to around 36 degrees Fahrenheit. Despite the approaching darkness and worsening weather, Michael Lanu, and David Greenberg insisted on pressing ahead, promising to turn around soon. Lou, concerned, turned back to rejoin Ron and Ralph, and the three began their descent down the Baldy Trail. Lou and Mike had hiked together many times, but this trip was different. They were responsible for 4 younger scouts, 2 of whom were on their first hike. The slower pace and frequent rest stops had thrown off their timing, and no one had anticipated being so high on the mountain after dark. Their overnight gear was 3 miles away at base camp, 2,000 feet below them, leaving them vulnerable if caught in the upper elevations overnight. With no adults nearby, and Mike's father not returning until Sunday, they were on their own. Most of the other parents, 35 miles away in Tucson, believed the boys were on a supervised hike. Furthermore, the trail, usually bustling with activity, had been deserted all afternoon. As darkness approached, the group had only 2 flashlights between them, and time and danger were fast converging. Lou returned to where he had left Ralph and Ron and began descending toward their base camp. By the time they reached Josephine Saddle, night had fallen, and clouds obscured the valley lights. With only 1 flashlight, they carefully made their way back to their campsite in Madera Canyon, arriving around 7:30 p.m. In total darkness, Lou, Ralph, and Ronnie reached their base camp as the nasty weather grew colder and windier. Utterly exhausted, each scout retreated to his sleeping spot to recover and await the others. Ronnie crawled under the tent he shared with David Greenberg, while Ralph tucked himself under the picnic table to wait for Michael Lanu. A weary Lou sank into his hammock. As they settled in, each was lost in thought, wondering what might be happening above them on the dark mountain. Ralph figured the other scouts were anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours behind them. Lou, however, was more cautious. Knowing Mike's determination to reach the summit, he suspected they had pushed on, despite his advice to stop. If that were the case, it might be 4 or 5 more hours before they returned to camp. They waited to hear the sound of footsteps or the chatter of their friends coming down the mountain. But there was only silence. Growing more concerned, they remained on alert for the slightest sound. Anything. Around 9 p.m., freezing rain began to fall, turning into a heavy downpour. Drenched in the rain, Lou retreated to Mike Early's tent. By midnight, the temperature had dropped to near freezing, and the rain had turned to snow, yet the other 3 boys had still not returned. On Sunday, November 16, 1958, around 4:30 a.m., the heavy snow caused the tents to collapse. Lou and Ron initially took refuge in the picnic area outhouse, but it was too small, cold, and foul-smelling to stay for long. Lou decided their best chance was to ride out the storm under the picnic table shelter. With only 2 sleeping bags between them, Ron attempted to retrieve his from his collapsed tent, but lost one of his shoes and the only flashlight in the deep snow. The 3 huddled together for warmth as the storm raged on. When the boys awoke at 9 a.m., there were 2 feet of snow on the ground and temperatures around 24 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow was piled high around them, and Ronnie's hopes of finding his missing shoe, now buried under the thick snow, were slim. However, what troubled them more was that their friends still hadn't returned. The landscape had changed drastically from the day before, when the scouts had happily hiked through the warm, tree-lined canyon. Now, the Madera Gorge was transformed into a frigid winter wonderland. What would usually have been a breathtakingly beautiful scene was now overshadowed by the severity of their situation. The scouts were growing increasingly anxious, feeling compelled to take action for their missing companions. Most of their remaining food had been buried under the snow. As Lou discussed the situation with Ralph, they decided Ralph would hike to the lodge to seek help. Lou urged him, "Go to the lodge, see if Mr. Early has arrived, get help, and come back." Meanwhile, Lou would start gathering their gear and follow later. About halfway down the icy road to the lodge, Ralph suddenly heard someone shouting in the distance. It was John Early, Mike's father, who had arrived at the lodge and set off on foot to find the boys' camp. Hearing the shouts, Ralph squinted down the road and spotted Mr. Early trudging through the snow toward him. Relief washed over Ralph, but it was quickly replaced by dread as he realized he had to tell Mr. Early that his son was missing, along with 2 other boys, higher up on the cold, snow-covered mountain. He immediately asked, "Where are the boys?" Nervous, Ralph replied, "I'll show you the way." As they returned to the base camp, Ralph hesitantly shared the grim story. Mr. Early's face fell as he learned that Mike and the other boys were still missing on the mountain in the middle of the blizzard. Now alarmed, Mr. Early urged Ralph to move faster as they returned to where Lou and Ronnie were waiting. He pressed Ralph for more details, and as the young scout explained, the full weight of the situation hit him. The boys hadn't returned, the snow was overwhelming, and the cold was unbearable. Ralph feared the worst. When they arrived at base camp, Mr. Early instructed Ralph and Ron to go to the lodge for assistance while he and Lou would go up the trail to search for the missing boys. Ron, now with only a sock on one foot and no shoes, ran down the trail to keep warm, eventually losing his remaining sock and arriving at the lodge barefoot. Ralph arrived shortly after, and the boys warmed themselves by the lodge fireplace while passing on the news about the missing group. A doctor who lived nearby checked them over, finding no serious injuries. Val Hansen, a ham radio operator, and his brother-in-law John Linder were at the lodge that morning. With the phone lines down due to the storm, they rushed the half-mile back to their cabin, where Val began broadcasting an alert on his radio. Ray Cunningham in Kansas City received the message and relayed it to Orville Bear in Tucson. Bear contacted the Pima County Sheriff's Office around 11 a.m. and then notified Dale Adams, who activated the Catalina emergency net. a radio alert system for the Catalina Radio Club. Val and John then returned to the lodge, broadcasting the alert using Val's mobile radio. The message was picked up by radio operators across the U.S., who relayed it to local authorities by radio and long-distance phone calls. A Santa Cruz County deputy sheriff was the first to arrive at the lodge. Though the search area fell under Santa Cruz County, it was agreed that Pima County would coordinate the search effort, with Deputy Sheriff Guy Hill appointed to lead it. Meanwhile, John Early and Lou Burgess struggled up the Baldy Trail to Josephine's saddle but found no sign of the three missing boys. At the saddle, a weary and reluctant Lou admitted to Early that he couldn't climb any further. After a sleepless, anxiety-filled night, Lou's energy was completely drained. In contrast, a frantic John Early was still determined to push up the trail in a desperate attempt to find the boys. After saying goodbye to Lou, the determined father continued his climb while Lou descended back to the lodge. Battling waist-high snow and wearing only moccasins, John eventually turned around as well and made his way back to the lodge. When Early arrived back at the lodge, Hanson saw how deeply distressed the father looked. The waist-deep snow, along with Early's soaked moccasins, had finally forced him to abandon his search. After briefly warming up and catching his breath, Early, knowing he needed warmer clothing and more help finding the boys, headed back home to Tucson to gear up and convene with the families of the missing boys. When Early returned to Tucson, he contacted the missing boys' fathers. Together, they headed back to Madera Canyon and arrived at the lodge shortly after deputies Guy Hill and John Walker had arrived. With heavy snowfall and approaching darkness, it was clear the search could not continue that afternoon. The three fathers returned to Tucson with Lou, while Ralph Coltrane and Ronnie Sepulveda stayed overnight in a cabin at Madera Canyon. Deputy Hill started organizing a large-scale search effort, set to begin on Monday, November 17th. Since no formal search and rescue system existed in 1958, Hill created one on the spot. He contacted the sheriff's posse and volunteer rescue groups from Pima and Pinal counties and arranged for a helicopter from Davis-Monthan AFB to assist with the aerial search. He also reached out to local ranchers for help. On Monday, November 17th, Deputy Hill convened a meeting of searchers at 7:30 a.m. at the Pima County Courthouse to provide updates and organize the search effort. He then boarded a helicopter at Davis-Monthan AFB to begin an aerial search. Meanwhile, Pima County Sheriff James Clark assumed command of the search headquarters at Madera Lodge. Around 10 a.m., Boy Scout Explorer Troop 8, along with volunteers from Tucson and members of the sheriff's posse from Pima, Pinal, Cochise, and Santa Cruz counties began the ground search. 4 search teams were quickly deployed to comb the mountainside. One priority was to reach the ranger cabin at Baldy Spring, hoping the scouts had taken refuge there. The cabin had food, beds, a stove, and firewood. A team of searchers broke a trail through 3-foot drifts, but after 5 hours they were forced to stop due to exhaustion at about 8,000 feet or 2,600 meters. Another group pushed through 5-foot drifts on horseback to reach the cabin, only to find it empty with no sign the boys had made it there. Around 150 people were actively involved in the search, with an additional 150 providing support. A helicopter and a C-45 from Davis-Monthan AFB, along with several civilian aircraft, scoured the area from the air. Bruce Lanoux returned home to gather provisions and equipment, then set up camp at Josephine's saddle, bringing the family dog in hopes it might help locate its owner. Temperatures at night dropped to around 0 degrees Fahrenheit and only rose to about 32 degrees Fahrenheit during the day. On Tuesday, around 100 searchers were out in force, but no progress was made. Ranch hands searching the temporal trail on horseback encountered a telephone wire tangled in a horse's hooves. This old phone wire was no longer maintained. They found a matchbook attached to the wire, 2 clues proving valuable in understanding how the boys ended up where they were. Recognizing the need for more manpower, officials requested soldiers from a local military base and bloodhounds to assist. On Wednesday, the search effort expanded to 300. With military leaders on the scene, a more organized grid search was implemented, with troops spaced in 10-foot intervals to comb the mountain slopes. Bruce Lanoux remained stationed at Josephine Saddle to continue his search efforts. On Thursday, a team of 15 soldiers went to the summit of Mount Baldy to set up a temporary camp and search the area. Friday, another 300 soldiers joined the search, focusing on an area where the bloodhounds had picked up a scent. That day, ranchers discovered 4 brush markers, a traditional Boy Scout signal that had emerged as the snow melted along the Baldy Trail. Saturday, Mr. Early and a number of friends and relatives joined the search, which had grown to over 750 people, but no significant findings were made. Sunday, November 24, 1958, searchers discovered remnants of a small fire along the Baldy Trail below Baldy Saddle, with evidence that someone had tried to start it using sticks, branches, and a Kleenex similar to the one David Greenberg carried. The Kleenex was only slightly singed. That evening, Sheriff Clark called off the bulk of the search, leaving 3 deputies to oversee further efforts as the snow melted. They would continue on for days with no sign of the boys, and on Monday, December 1, 1958, officials decided Thursday would be the final day of the search. For 19 days, the boys had been lost in the mountains, hidden by snow and rugged terrain, evading all search efforts. As the official search entered its final day, the fathers of the missing boys joined, climbing the steep path to Josephine Saddle, where Santa Cruz Deputy Sheriff Jack Sullivan organized the final push. Alongside him was rancher Mike Nagy, who had dedicated himself to the search, using horses, mules, helicopters, and even his own plane. On this last day, Nagy rode his Palomino horse, J. Little Palo, up the Josephine Trail. Near Macbeth Springs Creek, the horse suddenly stopped, its ears flicking and nostrils flaring. Sensing something unusual, Nagy called for nearby soldiers to investigate. A few minutes later, Privates John B. McKenna and Kelly Kinzer spotted something unusual and cautiously descended the slope to investigate. The steep terrain, slick with mud and patches of snow, angled sharply at nearly 45 degrees. One of the soldiers lost his footing, tumbling uncontrollably about 100 feet into the dense brush below. His fall came to an abrupt stop when he landed on something unexpected. A strange, musky odor filled the air. As he looked closer at what had broken his fall, he gasped. It was the decomposing body of 12-year-old David Greenberg. Shuddering at the grim discovery, he called out to his companion. The soldiers immediately called out to Nagy. While waiting for him to arrive, they carefully combed the area, searching for the other missing boys. Hearing their calls, Mike rushed to the scene and slid down the slope. Kneeling beside the body, he confirmed it was one of the boys. Rising to his feet, he fired 2 quick shots into the air, the prearranged signal. It had been 19 long days, but the search was nearing its end. Energized, Mike waited a few moments and fired 2 more shots, ensuring the message reached everyone. The sound of gunshots echoed eerily through the canyons. At Josephine Saddle, the waiting fathers froze, their hearts gripped by a mixture of fear and hope. They knew deep down that this marked the end of the search for their sons. At the site where the body had been found, Nagy carefully examined the remains of the first boy. Leaving the small, lifeless form in the hands of the soldiers, Nagy made his way back to the saddle, aware that the fathers were anxiously awaiting news. After taking a deep breath, he told them a boy's body had been found. Understanding the father's potential desire to rush to the scene, Nagy calmly urged them to return to the lodge and wait for further details, ensuring the recovery process could proceed without interruption. As Mike spoke, he avoided revealing which boy had been found. Yet, as David Greenberg Sr. made his way slowly down the steep trail, he felt a deep premonition that the body belonged to his son. His dread was later confirmed. Once the first body had been discovered, it took only minutes for the searchers to find the others nearby. They also came across a crude fire ring encircled by rocks, with David Greenberg's hatchet lying nearby and a scabbard mysteriously resting in the middle of the ring. The boys had not only built a fire but also fashioned a simple lean-to out of pine branches to shield themselves from the rain and snow. They had huddled together, waiting for a rescue that never came. Yet their bodies were found scattered. David Greenberg was discovered just 12 feet from the fire, Mike Early 75 feet farther down, and Michael Lanou another 100 feet below him. Searchers surmised that the bodies had shifted, either due to the melting snow on the steep slope or perhaps disturbed by animals. On Sunday, during a brief window of clear weather in the morning, it was concluded that the boys likely fell asleep when the temperatures dropped drastically overnight, and they perished during the early hours of Monday. The cover provided by the tree they were under made it difficult for searchers to spot them from the air. Deputy Guy Hill later confirmed this, noting that he had flown over the area in a helicopter on Monday but had seen nothing. As body bags were lowered from the hovering helicopter, the soldiers recovered the bodies and loaded them onto a litter. 6 soldiers then carried the remains. Before leaving the area, they built small cairns of rocks at each death site and placed crude wooden crosses on top. Led by Mike Nagy on horseback, the young soldiers, burdened by the solemn task, carefully made their way down the narrow and steep mountain trail to the lodge. The grieving fathers, waiting below, were visibly moved as the soldiers approached. Santa Cruz County officials urgently assembled a coroner's jury to determine the cause of death so the bodies could be released to mortuaries in Tucson. It didn't take long for the jury to reach a consensus. They concluded that the boys had died from exhaustion and exposure. No one could determine exactly when the boys died. Mike Early's father later learned that Mike had suffered a broken leg. Some speculated that Mike had slipped and broken his leg in a fall along the trail. Others suggested that, as his body slid down the steep slope due to melting snow, the leg may have broken during the descent. The truth remained uncertain. Regardless of the details, the families believed the boys likely died on the first night. Huddling under a makeshift shelter would not have kept them completely dry during the rain. When the record-breaking blizzard struck, the lightly dressed, soaked boys likely succumbed to hypothermia as their bodies quickly cooled. The cold would have hit them fast, wet and exposed. Their bodies lost heat 25 times faster than if they had been dry. Exhausted, they likely fell asleep by the fire on Saturday night and never woke up. Neither John Early nor Lou Burgess heard any response when they called out from Josephine Saddle late Sunday morning, and there were no signs of smoke from the boys' camp, which lay only about a quarter-mile away. On Monday, November 17th, 2 days after the hike, a searcher had ridden the Temporal Gulch Trail just feet from where the boys perished. He called out for them as his horse pushed through the snow. The scouts were found close together, with only one flashlight among them, making it unlikely they would have ventured out in the dark for help. People questioned why none of them sought help at daybreak. Mike Early, being familiar with the terrain, might have been able to direct one of the boys to find the trail and go for help. However, the steep incline they were on made it difficult to move, and under the tree's cover they were not easily visible from the trail above. The presence of green branches twisted for a smoke signal was another mystery. Someone may have woken up in the early morning and attempted to start a smoky fire but lost consciousness before succeeding. Regardless, they would not have survived the plunge to 5 degrees below zero that Sunday night. The official death certificates estimated the boys died early Monday morning when temperatures were at their coldest. Deputy Hill, who flew over the area in a helicopter on Monday morning, saw no smoke or signs of life. George Munzingo, one of the ranch searchers, shouted along the trail without getting any response, reinforcing the idea that the boys had already passed away before the organized rescue efforts began. Questions arose about whether the boys could have been saved. The initial search party on Monday was small, consisting of around 40 men and 10 young scouts. Even if the alarm had been raised earlier, perhaps at 9 p.m. on Saturday when the boys were overdue, poor weather conditions would have made it impossible to launch a comprehensive search. The snowstorm, which began in earnest at midnight, made the terrain nearly impassable and grounded aircraft. The weather didn't allow an extensive search until Monday, November 17th. In the days following the funerals, Lou Burgess returned to the mountains to see the spot where the boys had been found. As he examined the campfire, he noticed it didn't have enough kindling to keep it burning long, leading him to believe that Mike Early, likely incapacitated by his broken leg, hadn't been able to maintain the fire. This realization added to the sadness of their fate as Lou reflected on the wrong turn the boys had made at the switchback near Josephine Saddle. He had taken the same wrong turn before, ending up on Temporal Gulch Trail before reorienting himself and returning to Josephine Saddle. Years later, Ralph Coltrane, his brother Mike, and his sister Cathy Hufault, author of the book Death Clouds on Mount Baldy, where much of the information for this story came from, revisited the scene to rethink what might have happened. They initially accepted the theory that the boys had followed a telephone line down the slope. However, after retracing the route, they dismissed this idea, reasoning that the wire was difficult to see at night, even with a flashlight. Instead, they concluded that the boys had made a wrong turn at the switchback, leading them down the Temporal Gulch Trail. Exhausted and disoriented, it was likely that Mike Early had slipped and broken his leg, forcing the younger scouts to help him down the slope, build a shelter, and wait for help. In 2009, after ranch hand and searcher George Monzingo was interviewed for Hufault's book and recounted his discovery of a matchbook cover on the trail, Hufault had a new theory. Monzingo's horse had broken a low-hanging telephone wire. It was suggested that Mike Early, standing 6 feet 3 inches tall, might have tripped over the wire in the dark, just as the horse had. The boys had 3 matchbooks among them. David had already used some matches to try and start a fire earlier. He might have used the rest of that matchbook to build the second fire. The scouts knew others would search for them, and being only 100 feet off the trail, they may have left the matchbook as a signal for searchers or as a warning about the wire. This new theory explained earlier clues more clearly, and Cathy consulted Ralph and Lou Burgess about it. A small, incomplete Kleenex campfire found below Baldy Saddle hinted at someone inexperienced with building fires. There was no ring of rocks around it, suggesting David Greenberg had been left alone for a short time while Mike Early and Michael Lanou continued climbing. After waiting, David, feeling cold, likely started a fire for warmth and light. The partially burned Kleenex indicates the others returned soon after, and they continued their descent. Brush markings discovered just above Baldy Saddle, revealed by melting snow, appeared to have been made by the scouts, as no other hikers had been seen that day. Experienced scouts said the 3 small brush markers likely meant stop, perhaps to indicate where they turned back. Mike Early knew about the summit register, paper kept in a Prince Albert can under the platform. It seemed unlikely he reached the top without signing it. With David waiting below Baldy Saddle, it also didn't seem likely they would leave him for long in the dark. Time constraints further implied they didn't summit. After reuniting with David, they would have retraced their steps along the trail. The trio, exhausted, likely made a wrong turn just before Josephine Saddle and ended up on the Temporal Gulch Trail. The campfire found off the Temporal Gulch Trail was better constructed, with a ring of rocks but lacked sufficient kindling, suggesting Lanou may have helped build it. Mike Early, incapacitated by a broken leg or unconscious, could not have contributed much to directing the younger scouts. Regardless of how they got there, the boys' attempts to survive were commendable. They built a fire ring, cut wood with David's hatchet, and created a rough shelter under the tree. One likely climbed back up the slope in the darkness to leave the matchbook on the wire as a signal for rescuers. Though they fought to survive, the freak snowstorm, the earliest and heaviest in the area's history, proved fatal. It was a tragic convergence of chance and bad luck, termed the freak snowstorm of the century. Under ordinary circumstances, getting lost or having a leader break a leg wouldn't have been fatal. But that day, the combination of exhaustion, exposure, and a record-setting storm led to the boys' untimely deaths. The discovery of the boys' bodies sent shockwaves through the community. To the people of the desert valley, these boys had become their boys, and the sorrow was shared by all. The search and rescue volunteers undertook a valiant and extensive operation, one of the largest in Arizona history. Recognizing the need for a formalized organization, the Southern Arizona Rescue Association, which previously focused mainly on building evacuations, was expanded in response to the tragic deaths of the boys. This transformation helped SARA become a nationally recognized nonprofit organization providing professional ground-based search and rescue services throughout southern Arizona. a mission it continues to uphold today. Preparations for the funerals began swiftly. Catholic schools released their students to attend the services, which were packed with young people mourning the loss of their friends. Eddie Castro, a scout from Troop 70, silently entered All Saints Church in his scout uniform as a mark of respect. Moved by his example, other troop members rushed home to don their uniforms and return to the church for the service, paying their final respects. The loss of their lives remains a heartbreaking and inconsolable tragedy, etched in the memories of all who knew them. For those 3 young Boy Scouts, their journey, one filled with hope, courage, and youthful adventure, ended far too soon on that cold mountainside. Today, hikers along the old Baldy Trail come across small markers, humble reminders of where their bodies were found and the tragedy that befell them, which states, "Strangers, pause here and remember. David Greenberg, 12, Mike Early, 16, and Michael J. Lanou, 13, November 15, 1958, who passed to a better place." They serve as a reminder to all who pass that these boys once walked this very path, full of dreams and ambitions, unaware of the fate that awaited them on Mount Baldy. Mountains do not care about your plans or your timeline. They are indifferent to your desire to conquer them. Bad weather moves fast, and there's little room for error, especially when the weather descends on you. Your ambition will not keep you warm when the storm closes in. When you set out to hike a mountain, you must respect the wild, for it owes you nothing. The trail might call to you, and the summit may seem close, but nature will always have the final word. Dark clouds rolling in are a warning. Ignore them, and you gamble not only with your progress, but with your life. Know when to push, and know when to turn back. Start your hike early, giving yourself plenty of daylight. Check weather reports, not just for the day, but for the region. Keep an eye on the sky, and the moment you see dark clouds forming, don't hesitate to evaluate. Dark clouds, sudden temperature drops, rising winds, and distant thunder are all warning signs that you should be prepared to turn back or seek shelter. Know your route well and be aware of possible exit points where you can safely turn back or take shelter. Always be prepared to retreat if the weather takes a sudden turn for the worse. If you're above the tree line and hear thunder or see flashes of lightning, descend immediately to a lower elevation. Avoid exposed ridges or peaks, as these are the most dangerous places to be during a thunderstorm. Always pack layers, including waterproof clothing. Even if the day starts out warm, mountain weather can change quickly, leaving you cold and wet without proper gear. Bring extra food and water if you are delayed or must wait out the storm. Carry a headlamp, map, and compass. If the weather worsens, visibility may drop and navigating becomes more difficult. Carry a fully charged phone or satellite communicator, but never rely on them as your only lifeline. Let someone know your plans and expected return time. If you're late, they can alert authorities. If you're caught in bad weather, especially lightning, and cannot descend quickly, seek shelter. Stay off high points and avoid open areas. In a thunderstorm, crouch down on your backpack, insulating material, making yourself as small as possible. Cold weather, especially when combined with rain and wind, can cause hypothermia. Know the early signs: shivering, confusion, slurred speech, and clumsiness. If someone in your group shows symptoms, take immediate action to warm them up. Taking these precautions will help you navigate an outdoor disaster. If you've made it this far, please consider clicking those subscribe and like buttons. Want more outdoor disasters content? Check out these videos I believe you'll enjoy. Thank you for watching.